Hey friends, welcome back to the Afrophile pod, where I talk here with Africa's disruptors and innovators, who I prefer to call the lions and the lionesses of Africa. Today I have a very, very remarkable guest, as you would expect. I only have remarkable guests on this podcast, but today I have Nigerian, British, American, and to some extent Zimbabwean author Sarah Ladipo-Manyika. Welcome, Sarah. How are you?
As I was thinking about what we might talk about today, I was thinking about the first time that we met, which was, I think, about 8 years ago. And then the first conversation that we did together publicly, were you the president of the Africa um, Association at Berkeley at the time?
Yes, I was. I had just been met the president of the Organization of African Students, and I was looking for something really big to do for Africa Week. And they say you shoot for the stars, and you miss, you get the moon. And then I went for the stars, and I got the stars themselves. I was like, I didn't realize I could be that lucky within a few months in the position. But yeah, that's how we first had our public chat.
Thank you. I've just, got to know you over the past couple of years, and I just admire all the things you do, your curiosity, this series that you're doing, talking to different people, raising up voices, and, your interests span from your own kind of entrepreneurial business, political interest to fiction and nonfiction. It's fantastic. So thank you.
Of course, of course. Thank you. I mean, I guess for some of us who cannot be creators, we tend to sort of like delve and try to be curating what is already there, but also to some extent, just listening to voices and figuring out, what the paths that people have traveled and how that have helped them become who they are. But talking of paths traveled, I mean, you have traveled to many parts of the globe, including some parts of the globe that, many people will not have an opportunity to go to. And by this, I'm starting at the South Pole as going up north. But you famously, represented Nigerians. I mean, Nigerians are known to be anywhere in the world, and you happen to be the first Nigerian who has actually gone to the South Pole. And you did that trip in the company of your husband, who is also the first Zimbabwean to get to the South Pole. But that is not the most important thing here, Sarah. What people really want to know is the real competition. Who were the first to get to the South Pole? Was it Nigerians or it was Zimbabweans?
Obviously, Nigerians. I mean, come on. But I have to correct you, and I have to say, I actually was not the first Nigerian. There was a Nigerian man who I think went to the South Pole the year before. Um, but but I love the way that you're bringing up travel because I think, and you're kindly referencing the personal essay that I wrote as one of the bookends to my latest book, Between Starshine and Clay, and I start the book with Notes of a Native Daughter, which is it's a very reverent nod to James Baldwin, who wrote Notes of a Native Son, and James Baldwin is a writer who's inspired me in many ways. And one of the things that I'm doing in that introduction to the book is talking about the different places that I have been lucky enough to live in. I grew up in Nigeria, like you said. I lived in Kenya, France, England, America. And part of what I'm doing in that introduction to the book is tracing the path of my life, my journeys, and talking about how what I experienced, particularly around issues of race and identity, and thinking about the way that we work together as societies or not, how that has shaped who I am and has also influenced how I think about what I do and my writing and what I want to write about.
And I would just touch on race a little, if you don't mind. But I read a sentence in your book, the book that we're talking about here, Between Starshine and Clay, a sentence which I think sort of sums up the experience and the life of mothers, and specifically black mothers in the United States, in sort of their experience. I think this sentence is something that resonated with me, and I kept coming to it over and over again just to listen to sort of the voice of the mother, as you were writing in that introduction of your book, not of a Native Daughter. I mean, I'll read the sentence from my iPad here, but I have it in the book. So the sentence goes: trying to protect our young ones, we told them not to play with toy guns, not to wear hoodies, and not to walk too close to white women. Can you unpack that sentence for us? And sort of the for people who might not understand, readers who are just on the continent but don't understand the complexities of race in the United States and what mothers of African origin have to do in sort of the lengths they have to go to protect, as it were, their young cubs.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to take a few steps back before I get to explaining that particular point, because one of the things that I think I'm doing in the introduction to the book, in the book, is explaining my evolution, how I came to understand the way that there are different constructs of race and the way that different societies think about race and how race is socially constructed. So, I begin, I'll begin with me and my parents. My father's Nigerian, my mother's English. And so I was raised in a mixed cultural, mixed racial family and raised in Nigeria initially. And in Nigeria, when I was very young, people would refer to me as Oyingbo, which means, literally translated from Pidgin English, peel skin, pale one, uh, you know, someone who is not from here. So essentially, when I was young, I was used to being called or seen as other, white. And then I moved to England and discovered how, race was perceived, socially constructed in England, and then moved to the States many years ago now. And, really through my lived experiences, but also through writers, James Baldwin being one of them, Toni Morrison being another, someone that is covered in the book, who I was lucky enough to meet, began to understand the realities of race in America. And you were referencing the quote, something I said about raising my son. So my son is now grown, but it was a learning experience for me to see how, for all the progress that America has made and continues to make, although again I talk in the book about the nature of progress, sometimes it's two steps forward and then a step back. Um, the living as black in America is not straightforward. And as my son was coming of age, there were more, this has been the history throughout, but more prominent cases in the media of young black men and women being killed. And so, I live in San Francisco, which is known to be a very liberal, tolerant place, and it is in many respects, but it doesn't shield one from the realities of race. And so things that maybe white people take for granted, your kids can play with guns, or, your kids don't have to worry about wearing hoodies because people won't be intimidated by them, or they won't walk into shops and have people following them. That's not the reality, still is not the reality for black people in this country.
When you mentioned San Francisco there, I just, it fascinates me every time I visit, the city where you live, that there is always, some other new fascinating thing. In my last visit, it was these driverless cars where people just get in, and residents like you are not even scared of just being driven around. But talking of technological change, I think there's been a lot of sort of movement with AI and large language models, and this is something that sort of touches on the work that you do, not only as a writer but also to the extent you're still doing it as a professor, and where either students might try to get help, or whether maybe some people might try to get a leg up in their sort of products that they release to the market as writers. Do you think these models, as you have seen them, to the extent you have played around with them, do you think they're going to enhance sort of society's output in terms of literary works?
Before I come to the question of technology and writers, and I'm going to come to it, but I want to go back to Between Starshine and Clay and come to it that way through one of the people that I write about. So one of the people that I write about in Between Starshine and Clay is someone who's resident in this city. Her name is Willard Harris, and she just turned 105 last month. And she is used to be a neighbor of ours. We subsequently moved in the city. But I see her every week. I go for walks with her every week. And the reason why she is in Between Starshine and Clay is Starshine and Clay was a collection of voices, of conversations I'd had, of pieces I'd written about people who inspired me, particularly during COVID, a time that was rough in so many ways. And these range from people well known, from Toni Morrison to Michelle Obama, to someone like Willard Harris, who up until then perhaps not that many people had known about. One of the ways in which she inspires me is her curiosity and her love of life, and she always wants to learn new things. And I remember when driverless cars first started being used in San Francisco, it was about 2 years ago. She called me up one day and she said, Sarah, she said, this is AI. Have you tried this car? This is amazing. And it was free at that time. And she said, "Oh, I just love it. I get into the car and it says, make sure you got your seatbelt on. And then by the time I get home, she was 102 or 103 at that point. By the time I get home, it says, make sure you haven't forgotten any of your stuff. And it's just amazing. And she wants to learn about large language models, generative AI. I mean, she's, and so she's an inspiration in so many ways for me. Her life spans over 100 years. What a library of information and observations, and what a life she has lived. She also just inspires me just on that very human level of being curious about technology and AI. And so, as you were asking your question, I almost felt like, oh, you sure you're asking the right Manyika? Maybe you need to be asking James Manyika some of these questions. But in the spirit of curiosity and playing with things, I have been playing with some of these large language models, which is the aspect of AI that people are talking about more than other things in the last year or so. And I'm honestly, I'm not, I generally don't play with technology. I'm usually the last to adopt things, but I'm really interested in what this means for society and what it means, how this new technology becomes a mirror for humanity. What does it say about us? What are the fears around it? What are the upsides around it? I'm not teaching at the moment, but one of the things that amuses me when people bring up technology in the context of education and teaching is, oh my gosh, students are cheating and they're using all this stuff. And well, teachers are using the stuff too, you know, to mark, so, and there's so many, I think there are kind of knee-jerk reactions. I think when I include myself in this, we need to do so much more thinking about this and reflecting and asking questions. There's a whole question of, will humanity be able to use these new tools to level the playing field? Some of us are lucky enough to have access to great schools, to great teachers, great hospitals, to great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Does this new technology offer a way that it levels the playing field? And even when it comes to writing, for that matter, you know, um, some people are lucky enough to have great editors and agents and publishers and be within circles well connected. They have the social capital to get their works read and published, and whereas others don't. And so, does this afford us an opportunity to hear from those who previously haven't been heard from? So, I think for me, I don't have any answers perhaps to the actual question that you're asking, but I do think it is something that we should be talking about as artists and engaging in, and trying not to have that knee-jerk reaction that we all do.
I think one observation that would not, escape anyone who comes to view most of our modern societies, at least in the Western world, is how you get into public transit and people are on their phones. Their eyeballs are very fixed on their phones, and they have, little buds that have sort of blocked out the noise, and sometimes this can be at a workplace where people are actually working while they are sort of blocked in terms of what they are listening to. um I understand, and obviously I know that you have a great passion for for audio as a way of delivering stories, audiobooks that is. And going ahead, do you think that there will be sort of like within our community a huge need for us to reconvert maybe some of the old texts, make them audio so that we try and reach out to the people?
So, two things cross my mind. One, the question you're asking about audio in different formats, but also as you sort of describe the way people walk around the world with things in their ears, it just made me think about humanity and what are we actually listening to and what are we not noticing. Um, I've when I talk about what I do, um, and I think in the last book, Between Starshine and Clay, I say that wondering about people's life stories is what I do. And it's sort of the beginning of me kind of wondering and then writing stories. Um, I have always, when I talk about what I do and writing, I think I've always talked about the importance of storytelling more so than actual writing. And I think people appreciate stories in different formats, and that can be film, that can be through song, that can be through listening rather than reading. And for me, it almost really doesn't matter which is your particular format at a particular time in your life. Um, the conveyance of story through whatever format works for you is great. And I personally, as a writer, primarily as a writer, I think I've learned a lot, and I take inspiration from different formats. When I think I see you've got my books next to you, so when I think of like a mule bringing ice cream to the sun, for example, I at the time that I was writing it, I was lucky enough to do a workshop with Anna Devere Smith, who is this incredible actor and playwright who is one of the people that I highlight in Between Starshine and Clay. And working with her and doing a little bit of theatre, which I've never done in my life, or a little bit of acting, really was kind of part of the inspiration behind the polyphonic multiple voices in Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun. Similarly, in terms of something that I'm working on right now, I've begun to dabble a little bit in script writing and thinking a lot about film, and so that's influencing me. So in that way, so that I think is probably a partial answer to your question about audio. If you're enjoying audio and you consume stories that way, go for it. But one of the other things that I've been thinking about a lot is how we walk through life, and I've been conscious of this myself. If I'm running or if I'm walking, often I am listening to something. I'm listening to podcasts, like great podcasts coming from you or anyone else. But what am I missing? What am I missing in life? You know, what am I not listening to? And the other day, I was listening to a podcast. I was listening to Pico Iyer talking about his new book, Aflame. And he said something which really struck me. He said, that part of us that listens is much deeper and more interesting than that part of us which speaks. And it made me think about, well, first of all, what I was listening to, but just how I go around in the world listening. How deeply, how carefully am I listening? And there's a lot of emphasis on what people say, what I say, what you say. But the business of really, really listening deeply to the world around us, and then arguably to what we're hearing in our ears, how deeply we're listening to what we're listening to, and rather than thinking, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? Or, let's find the answer. Yeah, so I've really gone off on a tangent, but you've struck on something that I about.
No, no, it It makes sense. And when you mentioned about your books, I mean, obviously, I guess I hadn't sort of raised them, but people can see them here. Great stories that are packed in there. And one question I actually had about your books is, if someone is listening to this or watching this and they had never heard about your work, after this, on my recommendation, they pick up these books, they read them, and suddenly they have a Damascus moment of sort and realize that you're probably one of the greatest writers who have ever lived. If they want to find a collection of most of the other stuff that you have done, be it short stories, essays that you have written, is there a central repository where they can find this, a website, or would they actually need to get on a flight, come to the Bay Area, and
Well, thankfully, there's the internet. So, and thanks to AI, you can do a lot of research and probably find as much as you want. But I would hope that people, what I'm really hoping, and particularly from the last book that I've written, Between Starshine and Clay, is I hope it encourages people to go much further afield. And again, one of the things that I really like about the personal essay that I begin the book with is that it enabled me to even go beyond the 12 people that I highlight in Between Starshine and Clay, and just, you know, talk about so many other artists, curators, change makers, who've inspired me and I hope will inspire others. And in this particular book, Between Starshine and Clay, I'm looking particularly at artists, I'm looking particularly at curators, and I'm looking particularly at change makers. But there's so many other people that could be in there. As I was thinking about our conversation, one of the sets of conversations that I draw from in this book is a series that I hosted for the Museum of the African Diaspora entitled Conversations Across the Diaspora, the African Diaspora. One of the people that I spoke with in that series was the entrepreneur, the philanthropist, Strive Masiwa. And so he's not in Between Starshine and Clay, but it's an example of just another voice in a different sector, a different career that has had an incredible impact in many ways. And in fact, you were in that conversation, and I remember the question, I think you asked him two questions, and one of the questions you asked him was, what do you read? And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, he talked about all the newspapers he read, and staying au courant in terms of his own particular fields. But I also know that he listens to a lot of audiobooks, coming back to your point, and a wide variety, and he learns so much, and that informs and you know continues to inform him about things maybe that he didn't know before, and much wider than the sectors he's particularly involved in. He really loves history and so forth. So yes, so it's very kind of you to highlight my work, but one of the things, the main thing I hope, is that people go out and they curate their own lists and they find writers and artists who speak to them. And for those who want to do their own art, that it encourages them to do their own art too.
for those who, on top of finding their own works, will then figure out that maybe they might want to write, stories. I think you mentioned in one of your interviews that some of the interesting comments you got when students on the African continent started reading one of your books, Independence, was people would write to you and say, actually, you know what, Sarah, I want to write a better book than this. So for someone who is, out there, they think they now have a story. How does the process actually go, like, for you to then go from having something on a on your Google Drive to actually seeing it published, and how easy is it?
Well, the journey is different for everyone, and I would probably say the journey to get published is not easy for anyone either. And so I love it, and I've heard, particularly from Nigerians, young writers or want to be writers, saying, I want to write even better than you, and I'm like, yes, please, I would love that, because I'd love to read your work. But I think what I would encourage everyone to do is to say, I want to write as best as I can, or I want to do whatever sing, act as best as I possibly can, and realize that that is a journey and that it takes time. And one of the things, this is a sort of a funny segue, but one of the things that I often say when I'm talking about what I do and writing is I often start by saying, you know what, I failed English literature. And it's important for me to say that because, well, first of all, it's true. It doesn't get highlighted in CVs and so forth. Or, when people introduce you, they don't start by saying, well, this writer failed English literature. But I think the older I get, the more I realize how important it is to learn from our mistakes, to learn from our so-called failures. There's no growth, there is no greatness without really trying to see how we can do better and without facing hurdles and challenges. And I'll come back again to Between Starshine and Clay and say that the title itself, Between Starshine and Clay, is taken from a Lucille Clifton poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? Her poem begins, won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And I cite this poem now because I think this was a real inspiration behind that book, because the people that I cover, both in chapters, but people that I reference, are people who they didn't have a map. They made it up. They didn't necessarily, Michelle Obama doesn't know how to be a first lady. Toni Morrison doesn't start out by thinking, how do I become a Nobel laureate? Exactly. And they can't, and there's so many barriers and hurdles. And yet at the end, won't you celebrate with me? And so these are all those factors that are so important to recognize. And just coming back to your question about writing, I mean, thanks to the internet, you can get so much great advice and good advice from all kinds of writers and all sorts of forums and so forth about how you go about things. But I would just go back to just do the best you can, read widely, and, draw on whatever sources you can to find out the important information at the time that you need it. But realize that things don't come easily, that there is struggle. But then ultimately we will be able to celebrate with you. Speaking of, you've just raised Evan Mawarire, and he's one of the people that that is a chapter in the book. And you are referenced in that chapter, albeit perhaps obliquely, in terms of people that I was speaking to at the time that I was thinking about it and talking about his life story. And he's just come out with his memoir entitled Crazy Epic Courage. And so that's very exciting. So that's me kind of flagging, one of the people that I write about has written his own story. So I think that just came out last week, so check it out.
Interesting. I'll check it out. And this idea that you have coming from the poem and having a group of people who made it out without a compass, without a direction, but they figured it out. Does that in any way explain why you dedicated the book to Jules, your son? Is this because, you're telling him that, go out there, go and take the path that might not have been traveled by anyone, but, I wish you, all the best. And, these stories are just something to show you that you can be anything that you want, starting from scratch.
Yes, it is. And there's also my own bits of my own story in it as well, which I think is part of the dedication. And circling back to what you mentioned, the South Pole, one of the reasons it comes at the very end of the collection is because it was it was a profound experience in many ways. And in some ways, I feel it was almost like going to another planet. I mean, it certainly felt like another planet. And so it really kind of enabled me to think and reflect about humanity from a distance and to think about just how much we need each other as humans. And there on the South Pole, which is really, you cannot survive in that. Humans really should not be there. You cannot survive without everybody else. And all the things that we put in our way, all the things that divide us in this earth, whether it's, over different genders or different races, different religions, it just becomes, insignificant in that environment. And so at the end of talking and highlighting people who have gone through so much and who've gone through a lot of struggles and who've come through, to end it on the note of, let's really think as a race, as a human race, what's important to us and what matters. This brings us to technology. This is a new front, a new horizon. In some ways, you could maybe see it as a possible reset for humanity as we reflect on what really matters to us as a race.
The next point I was going to get to, sort of, within the technology circle, is just social media and its use among the people. How have you found it, useful to connect to your readers, and how do you sort of, create a community in your social media that you relate to your readers, but you sort of run away from some of the toxicity that's found online?
Yeah. In many ways, I don't feel I can really talk knowledgeably about social media because I'm only on Facebook. So, and my publisher, Cassava Public Press, when I came out with Like a Mule, basically insisted that I get onto social media, which some platform, which makes sense. And I chose Facebook because, as opposed to at that point Twitter, because I didn't want to be distracted. I didn't want to have a huge chunk of my time responding, commenting, and so forth. And also it's kind of not my personality. And part of the reason that I write is because it takes me some time to think, to reflect, to digest. And so I think there are people who are very good at speaking extemporaneously and who have an opinion on something every 2 seconds. I'm not that kind of person. That's not my personality. I don't, it doesn't bring out the best in me. And I think also as a writer, you have to be quite disciplined and not get distracted. And it's very easy for me to think of 1,001 ways to procrastinate. So I was very wary of social media. I didn't want to become addicted to any platform. And I also wanted to be able to really sink in. And this comes back to what I was saying about listening, really to listen and to read deeply and not to skim. And I think all of us, probably to one extent or another, we have less patience because everything moves at such a fast pace. And so my own engagement or lack of engagement in social media has been really to kind of preserve what I feel that I'm best at, the way that I'm best in terms of my thinking and my communication. Having said that, the upside of social media and of being able to communicate with people across the miles, across continents, across time, it's wonderful. And when Independence, my first novel, was being read by literally millions of students, it was an incredible way of being able to communicate and have some conversations with people that I ordinarily wouldn't have been able to do that with. So I certainly see the upsides, but I'm not someone who engages a lot. That said, though, I think what I have tried to do with Facebook, even to a small extent, is to use it as a platform to highlight other voices or people that, artists in particular, that have inspired me or whose work I find really interesting. So in addition to to talking about my work, which my publishers obviously want me to do, um, to use it as a way of talking about others. And that's something, Brian, that I so admire about you, because I see you even in just having these conversations. It's great, and I think it's something that we need to do more in the African diaspora. So I really applaud you for all that you do on that front.
Thank you. And while you might not be sort of the outgoing person, as you say, who likes, you obviously do travel a fair amount, and you find yourself in different African cities, and in other different cities across the world. When this happens, do people recognize you? Do they come up to you, ask for selfies and autographs? And what is sort of rather the most unexpected place where you have met a reader who has recognized you while you're just going around your own business?
That rarely happens. I'm not. I love how much you support my work, but I'm really not. I'm not a big recognizable name or anything like that. So yeah, so no, it doesn't happen that people come up to me and ask me for autographs. But I think this is maybe one of the negative sides for me about social media is, when I am in a situation where people know, okay, this is a writer and so forth, that I do feel that there's often a tendency for people to, yeah, just want to take selfies or just take pictures all the time. And people are not listening so much. They just want to make sure that they've captured that moment, done, tick, tick, now to the next, to the next. And so that kind of saddens is too heavy a word, but sometimes I do wish, and in fact, actually, sorry, as a follow-on, people will take the picture and then they'll be so consumed with uploading it to whatever platform that they stop listening, or that, then they start looking at, what are comments and so forth. And I feel that we lose something there. It can be a very ephemeral existence. But again, I'm somewhat the wrong person to, and maybe even the wrong generation to be commenting on something like this.
Some of the people who have had to listen to you, though, whether they were, we would say at this point, forced to do it or not, are your students. You have been a professor, and I went around on the internet just before we had this, so that I would just see what students have said, and I'll read to you one of the comments that I saw. Um, the comment went by like, Sarah is extremely kind. Her class is really easy. um, all you have to do is to go to class and keep up with the readings. Never really had homework except for papers and a lot of group discussions about the readings. She makes the class really interesting too. I've never really thought about visiting Africa, but she makes me want to visit Lagos someday. How was is sort of like, what would you say is the most rewarding aspect of being a teacher and a professor and helping shape the future generation of change makers, whether it's here in the United States or across the globe, wherever they end up?
I think the most rewarding aspect is actually learning from my students. So, Brian, you've never been a student of, but I learn as the years have gone. I learned so much from you, and so honestly, that it's a two-way thing. Um, Learning how people, meeting different kinds of people, seeing how different people process things, seeing how different people learn, the questions that people ask forces me sometimes to think about things in a new way. Um, yeah, so I think for me, that's teaching. I don't see it as a didactic. I pass on the little that I do know, and hopefully highlight, signpost other avenues for people to continue to explore and grow. But to see people, also just to see people grow and evolve, um, is so rewarding.
Interesting. And now I'm gonna dial back a little bit to something that we hadn't touched, but which is, your childhood and growing up. You grew up in northern Nigeria, and then you spent some time obviously in the UK, you spent some time in Kenya, and then obviously as an adult you moved to the United States. What would you say, you can tell us a little bit about, how exciting or uneventful your childhood was, and also what is the most, or rather the best place that you had, visited as a child that you always go back to, and you love it and reminds you of how you grow up?
When I think of my childhood, I think of what rises to the top is just the privilege of having been in different settings in different countries where different religions, different ethnicities, where people think differently, approach life differently, different social classes, and I guess the privilege of having been also in environments where, just down to my very own family, where people are of different races, grandparents, one side Muslim, another side atheists. And so much of my life, I think, has been in situations where, in order to get along, you've had to create bridges. And so maybe, as I reflect on my life, maybe, obviously that has had an impact in terms of the stories I'm interested in, the kinds of things that I write about, but it maybe has an impact on my ever optimistic, positive way of seeing the world, and knowing that bridges can be built between groups or peoples where sometimes you think we're very different. There's always something, there's always some connective tissue. So that, I think, that's the headspace in which I am now as I think about my upbringing and my childhood. But I think even beyond that, one of the things that I'm doing right now in terms of projects that I'm working on is I'm in the process of learning Spanish. Aprendo español. And part of what triggered that was a trip that I made, book related, to Mexico City. I actually can see the book just above my head here, Independencia, the Spanish translation of Independence. And I love to travel. I love to learn from my travels, and I'm really, really interested in being able to better communicate with people. So I speak French, and I speak and understand. I speak smatterings of other and understand smatterings of other languages, Hausa, Yoruba, etc., but no fluency other than English and French. And so I'm learning Spanish because I went to Mexico City, and I'm like, this is such an amazing city, and I really want to be able to communicate again with the larger African diaspora in Latin America. And so maybe this all goes back to my childhood as well, being fascinated by languages. And I know we've got AI that can help us translate, but it can also help you learn a language quicker than in the past. So using AI for that purpose too.
And staying on your trips, I mean, there's one trip that you made in 1992, if I remember, which would turn out to be one of many trips you have made to that very destination. Now, to people in the so-called teapot-shaped Republic of Zimbabwe, 1992 was a very, very tough year. It was a drought year, and livelihoods were lost. But to one Zimbabwean who I have found, it seems like it was probably the height of his joy. He took his girlfriend in 1992 to Zimbabwe for the first time. Can you tell us how you met your husband, and can you tell us what you saw in Zimbabwe in 1992 and what you have seen over time as you have returned there as a now partial citizen of this great country?
So my husband and I have different stories about how we met, um, but I will just give my brief, shortened version, which is, so husband and my brother studied at the same university. They both studied at Oxford, at Balliol College. My brother and I are very close. Maybe in a sense you can say it was an arranged meetup through my brother. But I do remember my first trip very vividly, going to Zimbabwe, and we actually got married there a couple of years later. And, in the spirit of just being interested in what I observe and wondering about people's lives and stories, I think in 1992 I wasn't there for very long to really observe and really understand what was happening in the country at the time. But, over the years, of course, I've taken a deeper and deeper interest, hence why someone like Evan Mawarire would be a chapter in the book. And thinking about Zimbabwe and writing about Zimbabwe have been have featured in what I do. So I remember, for example, perhaps a slightly later trip that I made in 2004 or 2005, around the time that inflation was off the charts and people were really struggling, and then there was the whole cleanup operation, and exactly, areas level to the ground. And I ended up writing a piece entitled Jrakwana, which was a sign that I saw as I was going around the cities, going around Harare. I saw people had scribbled this word Jrakwana all over the place. Enough is enough. And so that inspired one of the short stories that I wrote. Really, as I was wondering about, how do people survive? How do people make ends meet? And it was a fictional piece, but definitely inspired by the kinds of things I was observing, and also just learning so much from other Zimbabwean writers. So Petina Gapa, who I think you speak with in this series, No Violet Bulawayo, so many. Those are just two of the many, many Zimbabwean writers and artists who I've learned a lot from, in addition to visiting and spending time in the country.
Interesting. And for those who would want to know you, can we do a short, rapid fire, one word, tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Favorite city in the world?
Favorite city in the world right now? Mexico City.
Are you a night owl or are you an early bird?
Both.
Both? This means the secret to your productivity is you just cut on sleep while the rest of us are sleeping, you're making the work?
No, I really believe in sleep. So on days that I'm a night owl, I wake up late, if I can.
And one book that you think everyone should read concerning the African continent?
So my initial response...
You're free to name any of your books.
Well, if I were to name any of my books, it would be Between Starshine and Clay, because that's a book that covers the African diaspora, and you can take so many routes and be inspired by so many different people. The reason that's an impossible question for me to answer is I would want everyone to read a book that really excites them and encourages them to read more. And so it's for that reason that I can't say go and read X or go and read Y. Because I don't want you to feel forced to read a book that doesn't encourage you to go further. And that's also why I wouldn't say a book. Oh, I'm being so bad for my industry. I just say find a story. Find a story in whatever genre and run with it.
Many people who sort of talk to you and read your work actually leave out the fact that you, as we were mentioning, you're a professor, but before that you were you did your PhD studying the experiences of African students here in the United States, and I guess compared to in Britain. If someone is just asking you in the street what you found out in your study, what would you say are sort of the differences? I think I kind of have an interesting view of my own, having lived in London for 2 years and now in New York and in the Bay Area, and what I think sort of European society looks like compared to American society. But what would you say is the difference in what African students experience in Britain and in the US?
Well, see, that changes over time. And I was looking at a particular time. I was sort of comparing the 1960s and at that time, 1990s, early 2000s. And I think, on a very, very basic level, what I discovered is really where one comes from and the experiences one has had really shapes the way that you see other parts of the world. So just to give one example, at the time, and the students that I was looking at, those students coming from Southern Africa, so from South Africa or Zimbabwe, um, coming to study in America, had a much more intuitive feel for the way in which race was socially constructed in America, because they had grown up in apartheid, or at least had had parents, if not themselves, had grown up in times where race was, people were divided, and it's very similar kind of experiences to America. Whereas West Africans, Nigerians, even though there was colonialism, and as I write about in the book, had no experience of settler colonialism. So often just kind of a greater naivete about race and how that might affect or not affect their experiences. So I think that on a broad level, where people come from and what has shaped people's lives really has an effect in terms of what you meet and how you interpret something and how you fit in.
On an exit note, are you optimistic? Are you optimistic about Africa? Are you optimistic about the world that my generation is going to have to live in? Should we be looking up, or should we be trying to see what we can do in civic affairs to sort of change the world before it goes too far astray?
Well, two things. Drawing on James Baldwin here, who I think at one point said, "We don't have the luxury to be pessimistic." I don't have the luxury to be pessimistic. And so always, I'm not saying things will be easy, but I always have faith. I do have faith in what we are capable of doing as a human race. I don't think we can do things on our own. It takes working together with others. And so in that respect, I do have faith and confidence and optimism. I wanted to maybe end on a slightly different note, which was to say that one of the things I'm working on is a new novel, and its main character is originally from Zimbabwe. The novel is set in London. And the character is known as Jazz. Jeremiah is his first name, but his other name is Tafadzwa, which is after you. And I remember some years ago, because bless you, dear Brian, come to almost everything I do, which is just incredible. And I said that the character that I write about next time would be carry your name. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been great reading your work. It's been great looking at what you have done. One thing I will say, though, to people who are reading or listening is actually there's a trick question that I would want them to either put down in the comments or send to my email. And the answer, the question is really to tell me who Sarah's most amazing fan is. You have been very kind to sign these 5 books that I will mail to any of the people who respond in the next 2 weeks after posting this, and tell me the answer to that very simple and basic question. And congratulations to those people, because these books are signed by you. Can you verify in audio that you actually signed these books and this is your handwriting? What do I have it? There you go. There we go.
Yeah, what's the political? I endorse this message. Thank you so much, Brian, and yeah, thank you so much for what you do in the world. Thank you for the starshine that you bring to this world, and take care.
Thank you, Sarah, and have a good one. Enjoy San Francisco.